imagine that. I feel like I'm behind and they're even behind where we're at. So, yeah. Yeah, that's something, right? Positive for us.
A little bit better.
But so as a result of that, they're still wrapping up with that. I know that the one teacher did not really like the learning curve just because he had a difficult time getting it set up. But I actually didn't think it was that bad, and so maybe it was just a process, a learning process, whatever. Also, the one thing I didn't like about it is if I assigned it and it was past the assignment time, then you couldn't actually see it, and that part I didn't like about it.
They should just assign it for like a month later.
Yeah, but it just means that we would have to kind of deal with some things in there. So, question? I'm sorry, Noah? We are not going to watch the history of Japan in this class, my dear. I am sorry, but there are a few too negative or bad words in that video. I don't care if you're old enough. I want to have a job.
Exactly.
So if you want to watch it,
we don't need to talk about
history of Japan.
We just don't need to.
You have. It's so good.
What is it?
It's the history
because
of Japan.
it would be my luck, literally my luck, that an admin would walk into my classroom when it was playing right as it dropped like an F-bomb or
It's
something.
the United States. We could have a student that used boats.
Really?
Gun boats.
See?
Awkward.
Yeah, it's awkward. I don't want to.
Stop having it be closed.
Also, more than anything, I don't want that awkward conversation with Mr. Cody after it occurs either. So, just saying.
Keep it on the deal.
What if I showed it to the class?
I mean, it's not like none of us don't know the words.
I get that. I'm sorry.
But they're just like, no.
Okay, it has been a while since we've had a conversation about this information and whatnot. So I'm not entirely sure where we left off in this business. So some of you that take some good notes, tell me where we left off.
We were talking about Germany invading everybody.
Oh, we were here.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Wait, what's the next one? What's the next slide?
I know we talked about him a little bit.
We're not at that slide yet though. No, we're not.
But yeah, the last thing that I put in my notes.
Is Hitler taking Stalingrad?
I have FDR announces that in 1939, that U.S. is neutral.
Yeah, okay. All right. So, and we already talked about this. I kind of rearranged a little bit for my other class. But what you have to remember is that the United States in 1939 will say, we are neutral. We are not getting involved in this. Well, there's a backstory behind that. And that backstory includes Gerald P. Nye, who is the senator from North Dakota, of all places. And basically what he argues is that World War I, the reason we got into that war was because there were arms manufacturers and people who wanted to make money. So the ammunitions manufacturers and the banks basically were selling to both sides. Remember that, right? They were selling to both sides, and then there was the British put the blockade up, which then meant the Germans couldn't get the munitions, and it was largely going to the British, which we were pretty much okay with because we were friends with the British anyways, so that was actually all right with us that the British were getting predominantly most of the goods, but it was not okay with Germany, which is why they began using submarine warfare, and so then in order to protect those munitions, the British and the Americans started putting munitions on passenger ships because they're passenger ships, right? And so the Germans said, it's not actually a passenger ship, there are munitions on here, so therefore we're going to use unrestricted submarine warfare, and Lusitania, Sussex Pledge, Zimmerman, World War I, right? Okay? So that's kind of like rapid fire how World War I happened, right, for the United States. World War I, go because of Lusitania and stuff. World War II then, we don't want that to happen again, which is what Nye's arguing. We don't want to be drawn in because of people wanting to make money. And you have to realize, it's 1935 when he has the Nye Committee. So if you think about it, 1935 and Nye Committee, what's going on in the United States? The Great Depression, right? And so here we are as the United States in the midst of this depression, and also with a clear way that we could actually get out of the Great Depression. By making munitions, right? By making weapons of war. But Nye says we can't do that. Because if we do, it's going to clearly pull us back into war again. And we don't want that. We do not want to be involved in another European affair. We do not want to send our men over to die. And so as a result of his recommendation, FDR will maintain that policy of neutrality all the way up until 1941. Now, that policy of neutrality, though, will change as we move through time. So when we look at this, initially, we are prohibiting all the sale of armaments to belligerent nations. Now, what's a belligerent nation? Yeah, one that is at war. So 1935, belligerent nations are going to include what nations? Germany?
Austria.
Not yet.
What's the year?
Not yet. 35. 35.
Sweden.
No. No. Italy.
Czech? Czechoslovakia?
No.
It's just one country.
Okay. No. Germany. Japan.
I said with my other
I
guess.
missed Japan. Sorry, I missed you saying Japan. Germany and Japan. That's it. Does that make sense? In 1935. Okay.
They're the only ones in.
They were only ones that were considered belligerent nations in 1935.
They were best friends.
Okay.
So, no, but like, so people, defense countries didn't count?
They did not count, no, because they were not the aggressors. Does that make sense?
Just Germany and Japan.
Just Germany and Japan. Okay?
So this is
Italy
only
slightly,
against-
but not till the very end of 35. Okay?
So it's only against the aggressors?
Yes. Yes. Okay? So, 1936 then, we're not going to loan any money to those belligerent nations, which now includes Italy, but is still only those three. So we are still actually maintaining a policy that we are going to help out in some areas of defense for some people. But you also have to understand it's 1936. And if we look at the timeline here for German invasion, okay, and we go back to German invasion, right? Germany does not actually begin to expand until 36. It is in 1936 when they invade the Rhineland, right? So there's not a lot of other nation states that are at war. Now, Japan has invaded Manchuria and made it Manchukuo, right? So that's why it is a belligerent nation, okay? But Germany itself has not done that much invading. Even in 1937 then, it's not until 1937 that they actually withdraw from the League of Nations.
Japan?
Germany.
Germany. When does the League of Nations act like finally like fall apart and not become a thing?
Well, I mean, it's basically not a thing as soon as we wind up into World War II, which is, depending on, if you want to look at European, it's 38, 30, or 39, the United States 41. But we weren't a part of the League, so, does that make sense? So, I'd say probably 39, okay? Now, 1937, though, Hitler is beginning to expand, okay? Now, still, though, not very much, okay? Now, the United States look at this and they're like, all right, the reality is that we are getting closer and closer to war. But Nye argued that it was American goods going on American ships that caused part of the problem, right? So, how do we prevent that? Well, how do we deal with the submarine, unrestricted submarine warfare? If you want something from us, you have to come and get it. Now, it says nothing in there about not selling to belligerent nations. So technically in 1937, would we have sold to Germany?
Yes.
Yes. However, they would have had to
Come and get it.
come and get it, and before they left, they would have to pay for it. Does that make sense? Come and get it, pay for it, go away. We can remain as an isolationist country over here across the pond, far enough away from you. You need something, you come and get it, you leave. Okay? Pretty simple. Now, 1939 though, when he says that Americans are going to remain neutral, he has to modify this cash and carry principle. Because this cash and carry principle is going to possibly pull us into war. And so he takes that cash and carry and he takes it a step further, keeping cash and carry in place, so come and get it and leave. But also, Americans do not travel on any ship of any belligerent nation. Now, 1939, so that would now include France, Great Britain, Italy, Poland, Japan, Russia, etc. Does that make sense? Okay? So do not travel basically on any ship other than a ship that is waving an American flag.
And why?
Well, let's think about this. Why would he say don't go on any ship other than an American ship? Okay, because they could get, the ship could get sank because of the fact that they're fighting, right? And they're safer that way, but what gives us that historical precedent to know they would be safer that way? The Lusitania and the Sussex, because remember, the Lusitania is a British ship, but the Sussex was a
American.
French ship, okay? It was a French ship, not an American ship.
Yep.
So, either way, does that make sense? It would make these individuals safe. And if you remember, there were people that were pissed at Wilson for him not telling Americans not to go on the Lusitania. Okay? You remember Lafayette resigns because of that. So, now, as war lingers and continues in Europe, the United States officially remains neutral. Now that's largely because the vast majority of Americans are still not ready to go to war in 1939. But as 1939 turns to 1940, 1940 turns to 1941, and both Germany and Japan are continually expanding, it becomes a greater threat to the American safety and security. And while FDR understands that America doesn't want to go to war, or the citizens of America, we need to actually be prepared in case that happens, because it is a looming possibility. In addition to that, FDR, as much as Americans want to be isolationist, FDR, not so much. Because he recognizes the issue with America remaining isolationist. These are our allies. And if something happens to defeat them, they could possibly come after us next, right? So our safety and security is at risk here. So FDR will change his policy in 1941 and state that the United States is now going to become the arsenal of democracy through what he calls the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act basically goes along the principle, as FDR says, that, look, if your neighbor's house was on fire, what would you do?
The hose.
You would lend them a hose, right? You would help them put out that fire. And what would you do once that fire was put out? Then you would either get the hose back, or if you couldn't get the hose back, you would ask them to pay for it, or give you a new one, or whatever, right? But you wouldn't stop them in the middle of the fire and be like, look, I know your house is on fire, and I know you got a lot of other things to worry about right now, but can I have my hose back? Or can you give me money right now for my hose, because I need my hose? So why does he do that? Well, you have to look at what's going on in Europe, right? In Europe, Great Britain's economy is collapsing, okay? They can no longer fund the war using the cash and carry. So in order for FDR to really help his friends, his allies in Great Britain, he has to change the policy. Does that make sense? So it's less about FDR being like, hey, I'm a really nice dude, okay? And more about the fact that it was necessary. He could have maintained cash and carry, except for the fact that it would have no longer worked for the group that he was in an alliance with. Does that make sense? Okay. So in 1941, we will become the arsenal of the democracy. But as we prepare for war, Americans want to remain neutral. If we look at this, right, in time frame, February 21st, 1940, right? So basically the idea is here is that we are going to, if we wind up having to go into war, and if Germany is defeating France and England, then only then should the United States go into war. And the vast majority of Americans said we should not go to war, even if Germany defeats France and Great Britain. In other words, this is not our problem. Now, that is in February of 1940, December 16th of 1940. The Americans are asked, do you think it was a mistake to enter into the First World War? Slightly different question, but it will still factor in and show you America's opinion about possibly being involved in the Second World War. Was it a mistake? Only 39% by that point say yes, it was a mistake, which shows you that more Americans are now looking at the possibility of going to World War II as being something that not only that the United States is going to have to do, but also something that the United States should do. Okay? Now, as we continue to move towards war, in December of 1939, when he writes his Arsenal of Democracy speech, which will lead us to the Lend-Lease, the U.S. really cannot remain neutral. And so he, at the same time, called upon our Congress to start building an Air Force and a Navy that would be large enough for 2 oceans. Because what you have to understand is the position of the United States, right? And where the enemies are. One is in Europe, one is in the Pacific. We can't have a Navy that is split, a smaller Navy that is split. We're basically going to have twice the size of a Navy as any other country because of the scope of our country and also because of the land that we have in the Pacific, including the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii. Guano Islands as well. Okay? And so he calls for them to pay for this. Now that $37 billion ticket price tag was 5 times the amount of any New Deal legislation that he created. And people balked at the cost of the New Deal legislation. And this was 5 times the cost of any of his New Deal legislation. In fact, it was 5 times the annual budget during the courses of the New Deal. But in 1940, FDR is reelected. Now, he's reelected in an unprecedented, this is his 3rd term in 1940. Now, why would he get elected in 1940?
Because we're on the brink of war.
We're on the brink of war.
We're on the brink of war, right? He kept us out of war so far. Yeah, don't want to switch leaders halfway through.
What's going on.
He kind of knows what's going on. He's kept us out of the war so far, right? Our economy is improving. In fact, as a direct result of the Lend-Lease and cash and carry, unemployment has dropped and economic progress has gone up, right? Because that's what building a bunch of war materials will do for a country, okay? So he's kept us out of war so far. But not as large of a landslide victory as his previous election. Here he wins 449 electoral votes to 82. If you remember, the previous one was 532 to 2. Okay? Yeah.
Still, those those.
But still, yeah, he wins overwhelmingly, right? In 1940, then, he'll also push for Congress to adopt the Selective Service and Training Act, which requires all men 21 to 35 to register and go into the draft, okay? And then he also creates this destroyer base deal, which basically says, look, we're going to take 50 of our destroyers, and we're going to give them to Great Britain, part of this Lend-Lease, or the beginnings of Lend-Lease, and then what will happen is that in the end of the war, you'll reimburse us and help us to build even new destroyers. Now, really the only reason why we give those World War I destroyers to Great Britain is because now the United States has to do what? Build new ones. New, better ones, right? And it gives us that incentive to do so, okay? So now we can build better ones than what we have, okay? Now, in 1940 as well, he will meet at the Havana Conference, and he will sign an allegiance in Havana with 20 Latin American nations, promising to uphold the Monroe Doctrine. What was the Monroe Doctrine?
He was saying how we would protect the Americans.
Yeah, we will protect the Americas. So whatever's going on in Europe, don't worry, we will make sure that the Americas are safe. And we will do what is necessary there. By January of 1941, FDR will issue his Four Freedoms speech. This is in his inaugural, okay? And he's basically saying, look, I don't care what my critics say. We need to help Britain. And there are certain things that every person in the world should have access to. Doesn't matter who you are, where you live, what type of government you have. There are 4 basic freedoms that are so important, that are so fundamental to the human, that as America, as a country that enjoys these freedoms, that we should ensure that the rest of the world can have access to these freedoms. Now, here's the thing. World War I brings us into the world stage as far as the United States becoming world power. But post-World War I, we become isolationist. We don't want to be involved in world affairs. World War II will take us from being an isolated nation and an isolationist state to being the world's basically police force. Now, part of that is because of the creation of the UN, the United Nations, but part of that is a direct derivative of the Four Freedoms speech, a direct result of it. The reality that in every single place in the world, there should be these 4 basic freedoms, and the United States should work to preserve that. Okay? Yeah. It goes back to those Lockean ideas, right? Okay, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, okay, and the importance of these ideas. It goes back to the Declaration of Independence, right? It goes back to even Woodrow Wilson's arguing that we would be the arsenal, or that we would fight for those who submitted to the will of their democracy, right? To have a voice in their government. And he argues that everyone should have the freedom of speech. That you should not be fearful for speaking out against your government. You should be able to worship in whatever way that you choose. You should have freedom from want. In other words, he argued that you should be able to eat and have a roof over your head and the basic necessities of life. Water.
Hey, could I have Nick Solom to the main office, please?
Yep.
Thank you.
Water, etc. Okay? You should have these basic necessities. And last, freedom from fear. Go ahead, Nick. I am recording today's lecture. I don't know if you guys have noticed or saw the email, but hopefully YouTube is working now for you that you can see those. Yes, no? So I'll keep posting and keep doing video feed. It's okay if it's blocking me. It's not that big of a deal, honey. You're fine. So we'll adjust if need be the video, but I don't have like a stand to put it, so it just has to work there. But, okay. But lastly, freedom from fear. You should not be fearful from day to day. Now you look at these 4 freedoms then, and you look them in context of things that have gone on since, even things in our current situation. if you were FDR, would you go to war in Syria based on this Four Freedom speech? Yeah, you would. If you were FDR, based on Four Freedoms, you would go to war in Syria. Because those people do not have these four basic freedoms.
I was watching the news the other day. I was watching the news the other day, and they were talking about how this one reporter went in undercover to, I think it was Syria, and she witnessed one of the bombings, and it had a warning in the top, like warning graphic content, and this one guy was being carried by, and his legs were blown off, and I'm like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, but if you were FDR, right, you would be there based off of this Four Freedoms. And he argues that these should be our guiding principles, not only as the United States, but as the global citizenry. That we should work to ensure that everybody has these four basic freedoms, okay? And he basically says that we should seek world order through cooperation and in a friendly, civilized society, and that there has to be the supremacy of human rights everywhere. So it is the people that should come first in our society. Not our governments, not our leaders, but the people should be first within that. Congress will respond to his Four Freedoms speech and his call for the United States to be the arsenal of democracy by giving us that Lend-Lease. Now, we're going to get a chance to look at quite a few Dr. Seuss cartoons here. And if we take a look here, and we'll actually do an activity with it tomorrow. But if we look at this, right, the United States is the arsenal of democracy, right? Okay? And this was the idea of that, is how do we get goods there without actually going into war? Okay? Now, it basically seemed that we would give military supplies to any nation that was deemed vital to the defense of the United States. But it basically also gives FDR a blank check to prepare for war. And it also becomes economic war on Germany because we stop giving them any kind of goods. As a result, Hitler begins to sink U.S. ships, which will result in the United States having to utilize the convoy system in order to get goods over to Europe, okay? Or at least partway there. So I've got like my ship that carries my goods, and then I put a warship, a warship, a warship, a warship, a warship, a warship, and a warship, so that if a submarine comes up, it has to get one of these before it can get to that guy. And at least if it hits this guy, then we know that this guy's in danger, and we can adjust our lineup to better protect that dude.
That's just like when Harry was brought from his house to the
Sure.
It's the 7 Harrys.
But using this, by wars and the United States will lend over $50 billion worth of war products to the Allied States. In addition to that, the United States will meet in August of 1941. Winston Churchill and FDR will meet secretly on a warship off the coast of Newfoundland, and will begin talks about what they're going to do next. Now, this was largely in response to Hitler invading the USSR. The Atlantic Charter, as it becomes to be known, basically argues that if we wind up going to war, if the United States winds up coming to war, that we will go to the aid of Winston Churchill first, and then we will deal with Japan. In addition, it argues that there will be no territorial gains by the United States or the United Kingdom. Basically reiterates those four freedoms, that everyone has the right to self-determination, that trade barriers between us and other nations should be lowered, that we should have global economic cooperation, and then of course the freedom from want and fear, They also argued freedom for the seas and disarmament of the aggressive nations post-war. If you look at the Atlantic Charter, those ideas of freedom of the seas, reducing trade barriers, self-determination, no territorial gains, allowing people to have control of their own territories, those things are all parts of what? Wilson's 14 points, okay? So, Wilson may not have gotten his 14 points to begin with, but now we're back revisiting those 14 points. Recognizing that, hey, maybe Wilson was right. He also, remember, Wilson also said, do not be too harsh to Germany. He said that too, right? Now on the other side of things, tension is only increasing in Japan. And as a result of that, we are seeing the pacts or the different treaties that were put in place between the United States and Japan to prevent war are largely being shattered. So as war for the United States is ramping up in Europe, it is also ramping up in Japan. In Japan, the Japanese have continued their expansion outward. My map is covered up, so go with it. But they are now in parts of China, okay? They invaded down into Taiwan. They're spreading down into the northern Philippines and in the surrounding islands, and they are in parts of Indonesia as well. 1941 then becomes a key year as tensions continue to mount. Soviet Union has invaded Russia. The United States, or Soviet Union has invaded Russia. Wait is right, okay? So 41, end of 41, right? We're looking at second half. So by June, Germany will violate the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact and will invade the USSR. As a direct result of that, we will have the Atlantic Charter. Then the United States will put an oil embargo on Japan, which prevents the sale of all strategic materials, including oil, rubber, and metal. FDR will then move the Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor. Okay, this is June, this is in July, August. August, sorry. This is August, this is September, okay? And then in October, the United States will enter into negotiations with Tojo. Who's the Prime Minister of Japan. And although those negotiations are breaking down in November of 41, so this is all 1941. November of 1941, then November 25th, Tojo basically says if we cannot come up with an agreement, that there will be basically an attack is imminent, He doesn't say when it will come, but that it's basically, that's our last resort, is to actually declare war on him. So what happens then in 41 is we see very quickly the United States will ramp up into war. And when we look at this, with tensions mounting and the Japanese spreading into the Pacific, the United States is very fearful that a war is upon us. That attack then will come on December, what? Yes, 1941. Now there are very few dates in history that students should remember, but there are some dates that are so fundamental to changing who we are as a country that you should remember those specific dates. Does that make sense? Okay? December 7th of 1941 is one of those dates. It takes the United States from an isolationist, strong country, but an isolationist nation, to the police force of the world. And makes us also an industrial and economic powerhouse. Other dates, of course, include, yeah, right? The signing of the Declaration of Independence, right? July 4th of 1776, okay? It was on like Shay Leno or something. He used to do this thing called street walking when he'd go out and ask random people questions. And one of the time he asked people, when did we sign our Declaration of Independence? And people were like, 1985? Look it up sometime. It was horrible. I was just like,
When did World War?
And then
Last year.
okay, so here's the deal with Pearl Harbor. The Japanese basically look at the Pacific in this aspect, okay? They need additional strategic materials. And in order to gain those strategic materials for them, they are going to have to expand out. Now, they could expand into the Soviet Union, but then they're going to piss off the Russians, and they're not really ready for the Russian army. Whereas the majority of the countries who control this region, they don't have a very strong military presence in this region. So it makes it that much easier for us to take these island countries. So Japan looks at these island countries as a place for them to get those strategic materials. But they understand that there is one country in particular that has regions within this area, that it would not be good for them, or if they did wind up attacking, that there would be a larger fleet that would come to protect them. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island. Those regions, those are controlled by the United States. And they know that the U.S.'s Pacific Fleet is located in Pearl Harbor, and that FDR specifically moved it there because of the Japanese threat in the Pacific. And he wanted them to be strategically closer so that in case the Japanese attacked into the Philippines or Guam or Wake, and really, Wake is important because it's getting closer to Hawaii, but the Philippines is the most important here. Okay? That if they decided to attack, the United States would be in a strategic position to be able to quickly strike back, versus having to come all the way from California to then get into the Philippines and to back up our men that are already there. So he's going to have to strategically strike at Hawaii. Yes?
Okay. If I'm wrong about this, then I'm going to look like a total idiot, but I've never actually been 100% sure because I've never looked it up. Is Pearl Harbor in Hawaii?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'll show you a map of it. It's not right there. Here. So, basically, here's what happens. They know they have to attack strategically Hawaii. We'll pick up with this, I guess.
Who is Hirohito? How do I know that name?
Isn't he the leader of Japan?
I'm sorry, what?
Hirohito.
Hirohito, yeah, he's the military dictator. He's not the prime minister, but he's the military dictator.
So, someone like, is with the government right now?
Oh, yeah.
And way to keep hands on the time.
Back in, like you said, you were at
Which means Jackson is gonna be kicked off a bill, and Hamilton's going to stay.
I'm not sure about something.
I would hope that people would begin, like, I mean, Hamilton, I think, as a dude, people have been, like, had their minds, like, blown wide open about who he is in history because of the play. And I also think that in, like, the play itself has done remarkable things for the field of social studies, because there are people that are interested in history that normally weren't interested in history because of
We have Wake and Guam and then the Philippines.
Like,
What was that one? Okay.
would be,
Because no, they have their independence now, but at the time, we were positioned there. At the time, the Philippines would have had their
and
freedom
so
at
what
that
we're
time.
gonna do
I thought you meant like
is
now.
I'm gonna actually
What?
have you guys find, two
Of course I'm talking
political
about
parties.
during
It can be
World War
certain,
II.
But
I was talking
preferably
more of
so that you
now.
can kind of look at his stance. And there's actually a website, I'll have to send you the link, but you're gonna find two, and then we're gonna analyze them.
Should I-
Yeah, you can push stop.